Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle and this is my 75th video continuing discussing the detective fiction written by SF writer John Russell Fearn. To ensure a reasonable income following his marriage in 1956, Fearn needed to sell just 2 or 3 novels a year to the high-paying Toronto Star Weekly, allowing him time to work on speculation on stage, television and radio plays in addition to novels. To detail this extensive body of dramatic work, I discovered, amongst the manuscripts in Fearn's study after his wife's death in 1982, would require a whole series of videos, so I'll just mention a couple of them. Here we see a television script for a play called Bury the Hatchet. You'll see Fearn's manuscript. It's just a note I made for myself about what had happened to the manuscript. And there you can see it's set out as a scenario. So that was the television play. In 2007, I myself novelised one of these unproduced television plays, Bury the Hatchet, a murder mystery. It was published as the title novella in a new story collection in the UK by F.A. Thorpe and as an e-book by Borgo Wildside in the US. My blurb ran, George Carter and his family were just ordinary members of the community living peacefully in the small town of Uphill. But one fateful weekend, something happened that was to cause them to experience real fear and act completely out of character. The first trigger was when they heard a radio bulletin that a homicidal maniac was on the loose in the town, reportedly carrying a suitcase with a broken handle containing body parts of his dismembered victim. The second trigger was when they discovered that their new lodger also had a suitcase with a broken handle and found inside it a woman's leg and a sinister small round parcel. Now also in this volume was a second television play that Fearn wrote, The Frozen Limit. This is title page. And The Frozen Limit was an adaptation of this book, published by Sky in 1954. Frozen Limit. Amongst the many other manuscripts I was able to discover and rescue from the tip were 4 unpublished detective novels. Many a Slip, Many a Slip, let's see, manuscript page. The Man Who Was Not, not Reflected Glory. Title page there, Reflected Glory. And the last one, bear with me. See it there, One Way Out. So they were the 4 unpublished detective novels that I discovered. Now, following his marriage in 1956, Fearn had resumed writing detective fiction novels, and his first new novel, Barlined as by Hugo Blaine with many a slip. A murder story set inside a cinema. The story was one of Fearn's very best because he was writing directly from his own life experiences, so it was completely authentic. Before the war, Fearn's main hobby was the cinema. He was the proud owner of a 9.5 film projector and used to throw shows to friends at his home, showing early old silent science fiction classics such as Metropolis and Girl in the Moon. Fearn was to put his cinematic hobby to practical use in 1941. At the outbreak of the war 2 years earlier, as a full-time writer over 30, journalism being classed as a reserved occupation, Fearn was exempt from military service. But as the war continued, even journalists and men over 30 were called upon, and Fearn voluntarily took the medical test. However, he was adjudged as medically unsuitable for combat. He was still obliged to undertake essential war work, and so took a job in an aircraft factory. Fearn found the work arduous and crushing. It damn near killed me, he later recalled, but fate soon intervened. What happened next was recorded in a letter Fearn sent to his Canadian author pen friend Leslie Crouch, who published it in his fanzine Light in December 1941. The previous summer, in a dashing moment, Fearn had applied for a job as a cinema projectionist but failed to get the job. But my name was left on the books, and that was how my cinema manager friend, whom I've seen for years in the normal course of going to the movies, got onto it. Him losing projectionists like wildfire where they are A1 medical. I'm C3, remember. I knew nothing about it beyond amateur work when I said I'd take it on, though I spun him a tale. But somehow I got through. I got the breeze up the first time I opened out myself, but gradually I got a grip on things, and now I feel quite at home. I'm indebted to Blackpool film and amateur dramatics historian Stephen Nuttall for providing further previously unrecorded fascinating information on Fearn's cinematic career. In 1998, Stephen published an interview online that he'd concluded with Robert Sims, then aged 73, and living in retirement in a rural village, Little Eccleston. In 1941, whilst Fearn was winging it as chief projectionist at Blackpool's Downmarket Empire Cinema, the 16-year-old Robert Sims was appointed as a trainee projectionist or third operator at the much more upmarket cinema, the Tivoli. Steve Nuttall's account continues. In 1943, Robert became a second operator and then was rapidly promoted again within just 1 month to the lofty position of chief operator. As he was little more than 17 years old at the time, this made him not only the youngest chief in Lancashire, but also some months short of satisfying the legal minimum age requirement. To circumvent the law, the Tivoli employed Jack Russell Fearn, the locally based science fiction writer, as projection room boss. Bob Sims recalled his memories of the period to me in 2003. The situation could have been extremely awkward. Fearn completely lacked the technical experience to be chief projectionist at a larger cinema, and the young Sims actually knew far more about the job than he did. There could have been friction between them, but Bob found Fearn to be utterly disarming. He freely confessed his lack of knowledge and was happy for the youngster to actually be in charge behind the scenes. He was happy to assume the role of second projectionist. The two men became friends and got along like a house on fire. Steve Nuttall again. Despite the fact that the precocious Robert could ably teach him everything he supposedly needed to know, the eccentric author, who was also a member of the Magic Circle, stayed quite aloof from the technical side of the job, preferring instead to regularly entertain the staff with his astonishing feats of prestidigitation. Being an amateur magician was in fact another of Fearn's hobbies, and Bob recalls that he was extremely good at it. His skill and good humour kept the cinema staff entertained during the long hours of what was something of an arduous job. As Nuttall explains, a typical day would begin at 10 in the morning and finish around midnight. Moreover, if an air raid was in progress, the staff could sometimes be forced to spend an entire night in the building. Robert recalls seeing low-flying German aircraft passing regularly along the Fylde coast to bomb Liverpool. As incredible as it may seem, Blackpool Tower was the safest site in the area due to the fact that the Luftwaffe used the famous landmark to gauge the precise coordinates for the deadly aerial assaults on Lancashire's principal seaport. From the vantage point of Fairhaven Lake, one could see the night sky all aglow as most of Merseyside tragically went up in flames. As one might expect, the task of fire watching was considered to be of primary importance. However, it does come as a surprise to learn that this was one of the duties that regularly befell Robert. Apparently, the job of cinema projectionist was deemed to be a reserved occupation. After all, the cinema was no longer simply a venue for entertainment, but it played a crucial role in the dissemination of information, including the showing of numerous training films for armed forces personnel and what some observers would label as propaganda movies. Bob recalled to me in 2003 that he discovered Fearn was a science fiction writer when he was briefly hospitalised. Fearn came to visit him and loaned him a pile of his published stories in Amazing Stories and Astounding Stories to help while away the hours. Bob quickly became a fan and borrowed many more of Fearn's stories when he returned to work. He was fascinated to see Fearn scribbling away on notepads whilst the film reels were running. During his time off, Fearn would then type up his notes, and throughout the war, he continued to sell stories to the American pulp magazines. He also began to write more serious works, and Bob recalls that he was constantly reviving his manuscript of Blackpool Life, Little Winter, the mainstream novel with which he hoped to break into higher literary markets. Unfortunately, the book was never published, and the manuscript appears to have been lost. Projectionists were also responsible for operating the background interval music, and Bob recalled to me that whenever Fearn was on duty and he spotted his beloved mother in the audience, he would play a favourite piece of music, Stardust by Hoagy Carmichael. He remembers Fearn as an ingenious and fascinating character and regretted losing contact when they went their separate ways. Bob Sims died in 2004. Back in March 1945, following VE Day, Fearn applied to the War Ministry for release from his job in order to return to full-time writing. Permission was granted, and he gradually quit writing for the American pulp magazines as he became established in England as a novelist. Whereas his early magazine stories had been purely imaginative fiction, for his novels, Fearn began to draw more upon his real-life experience. Many a Slip, the novel, opens with Vera Holdsworth, head usherette at a small-town cinema, impulsively stealing the wallet of chief projectionist Terry Lomond. She has no idea of the dire consequences. Desperately needing the money, Terry is driven to burgle the cinema's safe, only to be caught in the act by Vera. Is caught in the act by Vera. Thereafter, the girl's fate is sealed as Terry conceives the perfect murder by an ingenious scientific method. Her death in the cinema is accepted as an accident by the police and the cinema staff, all except one man, Vera's projectionist boyfriend, Sid Eldridge. The characterization rings true, and the details of the operation of the cinema and the duties of the main characters working there are absolutely authentic. Many a Slip was a meticulous and ambitious piece of writing. It has an entirely original, authentic scientific plot behind the murder, which would have certainly qualified it as an impossible crime novel. However, Fearn inverted the plot, anticipating Columbo by several decades, by revealing the modus operandi early on. The suspense derives from how the hero painstakingly uncovers the method and unmasks the murderer. Fearn did not aim this novel at his regular short novel market, the Toronto Star Weekly, but hoped to sell it to a British hardcover publisher. He let the plot unravel in a realistic and leisurely fashion, so that his manuscript ran to 60,000 words. See there? It ran to a longer length of 60,000, much too long for the Star Weekly. He'd actually bylined it as by Hugo Blaine when he submitted it in 1957 to Hodder, the successors to his former UK hardcover publisher. Unfortunately, the UK detective fiction market was at that time in a state of retrenchment, presumably because the lending library markets were dying out then, and the UK genre publishers were tightening their belts. Fearn was unable to find a publisher during his lifetime. There's no surviving record of this having been submitted anywhere else after trying Hodder, until I myself sent the manuscript to Robert Hale. See their letter here. Incidentally, also submitted along with The Man Who Was Not, 2 novels. Editor John Hale wrote back to say that both stories were quite good and that he really would have liked to publish them, but had finally decided against it because the author's name is not known. Ironically, over 20 years later, I would sell John Hale more than a score of Fearn's Western novels, which he was then eager to get. Notwithstanding, I was able to sell Many a Slip in 2009 to F.A. Thorpe's Linford Mystery Library. And in 2010 to Borgo Wildside, for whom I retitled it as Pattern of Murder. My blurb read, for cinema projectionist Sid Eldridge, it seemed that things couldn't get any worse. First, circumstantial evidence had made him a police suspect in their investigation into a robbery at the cinema where he worked. Next, his fiancée Vera was horribly killed in the same cinema, victim of a falling light fixture. Then he accidentally discovered strange, intricate patterns traced in the dust on the wooden frame of a still case. And from this curious discovery, a ruthless murderer would be revealed. These books are currently available online from Amazon. Now, not just myself, but leading crime bloggers have hailed this novel as a masterpiece. On no account should it be missed. Now, in this next novel, the man who was not, Fearn brought back scientist Solly Garson, who had previously appeared in the Star Weekly novel Robbery Without Violence. Now, this complex plot concerns attempts made by a serial killer to wipe out the entire family of eminent surgeon Sir Gerald Dawson. The killer remains offstage and is never seen. Indeed, he appears not to exist. Hence the title. When two members of Dawson's family die in quick succession, it becomes evident that the apparently accidental deaths were murders, and Chief Inspector Hargraves is in charge of the investigation. A particularly baffling feature of the murders is that the victims receive a telephone call beforehand, predicting the precise date and time, but not the manner in which they will meet their death. The predictions prove true, and Hargraves is forced to turn to Solly Garson for help. The brilliant scientist needs all his cunning and ingenuity to unmask the killer, making this one of Fearn's most entertaining murder mysteries. Fearn's follow-up Hargraves Garson novel had presumably been submitted initially to the Star Weekly, but was not published by them, despite being an absolute humdinger and positively bristling with locked room, impossible crime murders. But since I don't have any related correspondence, it's not possible to state the reasons for the rejection. However, it's highly likely that with the reduction in length of the novels after 1957, firstly to 32,000 words, and then in 1959, reducing to only 25,000 words, novella length, the editors at the Star may simply have adjudged The Man Who Was Not, which Fearn had written and submitted in a length of 50,000 words, was too difficult to successfully cut. Fearn had actually prepared two separate 50,000 word typescripts, and this is the second one. One for the Star featuring Garson and Chief Inspector Hargreaves, and this one here for the UK featuring his established characters of Dr. Carruthers and Chief Inspector Garth. Unfortunately, the latter version didn't find a publisher either. The late 1950s being a difficult publishing climate in the UK, a period of retrenchment after the earlier era of boom and bust. The publishers of the earlier Carruthers novels, Stanley Paul, were still in operation, but they no longer published fiction. When I sought to have the novel printed, I took the decision to use the Solly Garson version so I could link it to Robbery Without Violence. The quality of the novel was attested, you see here, when I was able to sell it to the Italian market, where it appeared in translation in 1992. See, the Italian title was The Invisible Assassin, but this is the novel we're talking about. So it was first published in Italy. And then it was also published by Thorpe in the Mystery Library. You can see that edition there. And The Wild Side in 2011. It's the American version of it. And there's 2006 Canadian omnibus, Battered Silicon Press. See the same novel. This was its first hardcover publication. Both the Wildside and Thorpe editions are currently available online from Amazon. My blurb reads, Gerald Dawson was the first to die in an apparent road accident. But when other members of his family received mysterious telephone calls informing them of their own imminent demise, and the predictions come true, Scotland Yard soon realises there are serial killers at work. Baffled, the police call in Dr. Solly Garson, a specialist in scientific puzzles. But can even he save the few remaining Dawsons from the cunning killer, a man who appears not to exist? Since he was aiming most of his detective novels at the Star Weekly, for Reflected Glory, the next novel I want to discuss, Fearn decided to revive another of his previous detectives, Dr. Adam Castle. Dr. Adam Castle, you will remember, was the psychiatrist investigator of Shattering Glass in 1947. Now there's an intriguing biblio-mystery. Can you open it, the thing? That's it. Well, the mystery is that one of the most eerie and effective scenes in this novel is where Fearn describes the discovery of a room in the heroine's house that's full of dolls' furniture, and the woman herself is dressed as a young girl and seen playing with the dolls and the minute furniture. The scene had definite resonances with a similar description of a room in the short romantic crime story entitled Quiet Holiday, which is there. And that was published in the Romances album 1947, Gerald G. Swan, under the byline of Van G. Mason. The development of the short story is different and has an even darker and more sinister explanation. But was Fearn the author? My researchers found only one more Van G. Mason story, published by Swan at that time, a non-sinister romantic story in their monthly magazine Affinity. Now, Fearn's known to have written many stories for Swan, and some of them were unpublished or untraced. So his authorship of the Mason stories is certainly possible. The parallels of Quiet Holiday with Reflected Glory certainly make it possible. But despite its intriguing plot, the novel was destined to remain unpublished during Fearn's lifetime. Its presumed rejection by the Star Weekly was almost certainly because they considered it too difficult to condense, quite apart from the plethora of competing manuscripts from other established authors. Fearn had written it to a full novel length because he hoped to also sell it in the UK. Now, the only surviving related correspondence in his files shows that it was submitted to and turned down by the Scottish giants D.C. Thomson, where Fearn hoped it might be serialised in one of their women's weeklies by giving it a strong romantic angle. Thomson's submission policy for novels was to ask authors to submit only the first chapter with a synopsis of the remainder. Thomson's praised the writing and characterization, but still turned it down purely on the strength of the first chapter and the synopsis. But they invited further submissions that Fearn sadly did not live to make. Now, you see there, I just succeeded in selling the novel to Italian translation in 1986. And Thorpe published the first English edition in December 2005 in their Linford Mystery Library large print series. It was also published in the US, as you see there, by Wildside in 2012. And the battered silicone omnibus, which we've seen a few times, also printed the story, Reflected Glory. There we see, it's the Italian same novel, and that was its first English presentation. Now, my blurb on this read, when rising young artist Clive Hexley, RA, vanishes, his friends suspect foul play. Chief Inspector Calthorpe of Scotland Yard is called upon to look into the disappearance, and his investigations lead him to question Hexley's ex-fiancée, Elsa Faraday. Elsa confesses that she has murdered the artist and thrown his body into a swamp. That's suggested on the cover there. Thrown his body into a swamp. But the girl's peculiar manner puzzles Calthorpe, and he hesitates to make an arrest, particularly as Hexley's body cannot be found. It's not until Calthorpe calls in Dr. Adam Castle, the redoubtable psychiatrist investigator, that the strange mystery of Elsa's behaviour and the artist's disappearance is solved. Now, the final detective novel that I rescued was One Way Out, which we see here. Turn to it. But this novel was actually not finished. If we look at the very last page, which Fearn numbered 96, Fearn was continuing the novel, and he broke off and he wrote those notes, brief notes to himself about how he intended to finish the novel. And turn back here, you see, there's page 96, well, there's his first draft of page 96, but he then broke off and made his notes for completing it. And these pages which we see here were his expansion of the notes from his own synopsis, but unfortunately the novel ended there on page 107 without having reached the end. In fact, Fearn himself was in two minds about the ending. He suggested an alternate ending there, but he then crossed it through himself. And those final notes there are how Fearn was going to finish the novel. But unfortunately, I couldn't make head nor tail of the final section. I couldn't see how the novel actually finished. And so the manuscript remained uncompleted and unpublished for the next 30 years, whilst I continued to puzzle about it. Then I woke up one day in 2011 with an interpretation of what the notes could have meant. I'd literally dreamt an ending for the novel. I immediately set to work. And within just a few days I'd completed it. It was sent there, as you see, to Borgo, Wildside, and immediately accepted and published by them. and reprinted their book, and then it was reprinted in the Linford Mystery Library. It's still available online from Amazon and from Abe Books. Now here's my blurb for it, which read, on a train trip to Scotland with his chief clerk Martin Lee, London financier Morgan Dale is suddenly confronted by his embittered ex-secretary whom he recently sacked. Janice Elton had once been obsessed with him, but the happily married Dale had spurned her romantic advances, and now Janice wanted revenge. Returning to their carriage, Lee finds Dale alone with the dead body of Janice, whom Dale claims had committed suicide by taking strychnine. With the situation incriminating Dale, Lee advises him to remove any identification and throw the girl's body from the train. But when the police eventually identify her and come to believe she's been murdered, Lee begins to blackmail Dale. And so, having completed, returned to publication, as we've seen there, all of Fearn'S surviving detective manuscripts, I rest content.